The last apple pie sat on my small wooden table, its latticed crust a monument to failure. It was the only thing of beauty she had, and after 8 hours under the relentless Montana sun, even its buttery sheen had surrendered to the dust of redemption. 18 years old, orphaned, and with a name most folks in town wouldn't bother to learn, Mai had poured the last of her flour and the hope in her heart into 12 pies. 11 others, filled with summer peaches and wild berries, had already been taken to the back of the saloon to be sold for scraps, their crusts gone soft in the heat. But this one, this perfect apple pie, she couldn't bear to part with. It was the recipe her mother had taught her, a legacy measured in cinnamon and sliced fruit. The market around her was a cacophony of commerce and survival. Cattlemen shouted over prices, a blacksmith's hammer rang a relentless rhythm, and women in bonnets haggled for bolts of calico. But a circle of silence seemed to exist around Mai's table. People's eyes slid past her plain beige prairie dress, past the humble offering on her table. They saw her face, her dark hair tied back in a simple knot, and saw a foreigner, a curiosity, or worse, nothing at all. Her father had come to work the railroad, laying track until the prairie dust filled his lungs and laid him in the ground. Her mother followed a year later, leaving Mai with nothing but a rolling pin and the knowledge that a good pie could be a prayer. Today, it seemed that prayer had gone unanswered. She began to gather the worn flour sacks she used as a tablecloth, her movement slow with defeat. Another day of failure. The rent on her small room behind the laundry was due, and the coins in her pocket wouldn't cover half of it. She would have to go to Mr. Henderson at the general store again, hat in hand, and ask for credit on flour and sugar, enduring his pinched stare and the pity that felt sharper than scorn. Then, a pair of boots stopped before her table. They were not the scuffed, manure-caked boots of a ranch hand, nor the polished dress shoes of a town merchant. They were worn leather, clean but scarred, the kind of boots that had walked 1,000 miles and stood their ground in 100 different places. Mai kept her eyes down, bracing for a cruel word or a dismissive gesture. "How much for the pie?" a voice asked. It was low and steady, with a gravelly edge that seemed to cut through the market's noise. Mai looked up, her breath catching in her throat. The man was tall, his frame lean but solid under a dusty duster. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that spoke of things seen and not forgotten. A Colt revolver rested easy on his hip, its handle smooth and dark. He wasn't looking at her with pity or contempt. He was just looking, his gaze direct and unreadable. He was a gunslinger, it was in the way he stood, a stillness that was more dangerous than any sudden movement. 10 cents, sir, she whispered, her voice barely a thread of sound. He nodded slowly, his eyes still on the pie. The silence stretched, and Mai felt the familiar heat of shame creep up her neck. He would scoff at the price, or perhaps just turn and walk away, leaving her in the wake of his silent judgment. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver dollar, placing it on the table. The coin gleamed against the rough wood. It was more than she made in a good week. "I'll take them all," he said. Mai stared at the coin, then back at his face, confusion knotting her brow. "Sir? There is only 1 inch. You had others," he stated, not as a question. His gaze flickered over the empty space on her table. "You'll bake more for tomorrow." I don't understand," she stammered, her fingers hovering over the silver dollar, afraid to touch it. "It's a simple transaction," he said, his voice softening just a fraction. "I'm buying your pies. All of them. For tomorrow." And the day after he looked directly at her then, and for the first time, she saw something beyond the hard exterior. A flicker of something. It wasn't pity. It was something quieter, more complex. "Bake whatever you like. I'll be here at sundown to collect them." Before she could form another question, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the throng of the market as if he were a ghost. The crowd parted for him without seeming to know why. Mai was left standing alone, the heavy silver dollar warming in her palm, the unsold apple pie sitting before her like a promise and a mystery all at once. She did not yet know that the coin was the smallest part of the price he was willing to pay. The next morning, Mai rose before the sun, her mind a whirlwind of fear and a strange, fragile hope. The gunslinger's silver dollar sat on her windowsill, catching the first pale light of dawn. It felt like a dream. She'd spent half the night convinced he was mocking her, that he would never return. But the weight of the coin was real, and with it, she had bought flour, sugar, butter, and a basket of the last sweet peaches of summer. She worked with a frantic energy, her hands moving with the muscle memory passed down from her mother. The small room filled with the warm, comforting scent of baking. For the first time in months, it felt less like a rented space and more like a home. She baked 12 pies, each one a perfect golden brown, their fillings bubbling with sweetness. She made peach, apple, and a few with wild berries she'd picked herself at the edge of town. Each one was a testament to her skill, a silent answer to the town's indifference. When she set up her table in the market that afternoon, the whispers started almost immediately. People who had ignored her for months now stared openly. Her table, laden with a dozen beautiful pies, was an anomaly, a spectacle. It was a declaration of success that nobody could understand. The success, however, drew a different kind of attention. Mr. Sterling, the owner of the town's only proper mercantile and a man whose smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes, strode over to her table. He was a pillar of Redemption's small society, a man who controlled credit, supplies, and by extension, lives. "Well, well," he said, his voice oozing a false pleasantry. "Quite the little enterprise you have here, miss." He let the question hang in the air, a deliberate reminder that her name was of no consequence to him. "My," she said softly, keeping her eyes on her pies. "My," he repeated, tasting the name as if it were a strange spice. "I must say, I'm surprised. Business must be booming." He gestured to the dozen pies. "Who, I wonder, is purchasing so many sweets from an unestablished vendor?" The threat was veiled but clear. He was questioning her legitimacy, planting a seed of doubt for the townsfolk who were now listening intently. Mai's hands trembled beneath the table. "I have a customer," she said, her voice tight. Sterling laughed, a short, sharp sound. "A single customer? For all this?" How mysterious. He leaned closer, his shadow falling over her table. He picked up a peach pie, his thumb pressing into the delicate crust, leaving an ugly indentation. "You must be careful. Folks in this town value cleanliness. They need to know where their food comes from. Who prepared it? We have standards." He was painting her as dirty, as an outsider whose hands were not to be trusted. It was a poison she couldn't fight. Her face burned with humiliation. "My kitchen is clean," she insisted, her voice shaking. "My hands are clean." "Are they?" Sterling's eyes narrowed. With a flick of his wrist, he sent the pie tumbling from his hand. It hit the dusty ground with a soft, sickening thud, splitting open and spilling its sweet, sticky contents into the dirt. A collective gasp went through the onlookers. Tears pricked Mai's eyes, hot and sharp. He hadn't just ruined a pie, he had trampled on her work, her dignity, in front of the entire town. She stared at the broken pie, the sweet smell of peaches mixing with the dry scent of dust, and felt something inside her crumble. "A regrettable accident," Sterling said with a thin smile, turning to the crowd. "As I was saying, one must be careful." But before he could continue his sermon, a quiet voice cut through the air. "I believe you owe the lady for that pie." It was the gunslinger. He stood just behind Sterling, having appeared as silently as he had the day before. His face was calm, but his eyes were fixed on the merchant with an intensity that made the air crackle. His name, Mai would later learn, was Arthur Vance. Sterling turned, his condescending smile faltering as he took in the man before him. He clearly recognized the type. "This is no concern of yours, friend," he said, trying to regain his footing. Arthur took a step forward, not menacingly, but with a deliberate purpose that drew every eye. He knelt, his duster settling in the dust, and looked at the ruined pie. "Looks like a fine pie," he said, his voice deceptively mild. He then looked up at Sterling. "The price is 15 cents. 15? Sterling scoffed. "She told me 10 yesterday." The price went up, Arthur said, his voice flat. For damaged goods he rose to his full height, and though he was no taller than Sterling, he seemed to tower over him. Pay the lady. The command was not loud, but it carried the weight of a thrown stone. The market had gone utterly silent. Every person was watching, waiting to see what Sterling would do. The merchant's face flushed a deep red. To back down now, in front of the whole town, was to lose face entirely. But to challenge the stranger was a risk his calculating mind was unwilling to take. The man's hand rested near the butt of his pistol, not as a threat, but as a simple fact. Gritting his teeth, Sterling fumbled in his waistcoat, produced 2 coins, and slapped them onto Mai's table. Keep the change, he snarled, before turning on his heel and stalking away, his dignity in tatters. Arthur watched him go, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to Mai. The hardness in his eyes softened as he looked at her. He gestured to the remaining 11 pies. I'll take these now, he said, placing a stack of coins on the table that was far more than they were worth. He began to gather the pies, his large, calloused hand surprisingly gentle. Mai found her voice. You didn't have to do that. A man should pay for what he breaks, Arthur said simply. He paused, one of the pies in his hands. I'll be back tomorrow. But not here. He looked around at the curious, whispering faces of the townspeople. Meet me after the market closes. By the old cartonwood near the creek. It's quieter there. He didn't wait for her answer. He just gathered the rest of the pies and walked away, leaving Mai with a pile of coins, a stunned audience, and a heart that was beating with a terrifying, unfamiliar rhythm. He had defended her, had stood for her when no one else would. But in doing so, he had made them both a target. He had not told her that Mr. Sterling was the very reason he had come to redemption, and their public confrontation had just accelerated a timeline he was no longer in control of. The meeting by the creek felt clandestine, a world away from the noise and judgment of the market. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, and the gentle murmur of the water was the only sound. Mai arrived first, clutching a basket that held a single, perfect apple pie, a silent offering of gratitude. She smoothed the front of her beige dress, her nerves aflutter. This man was a puzzle, a protector who appeared from nowhere and asked for nothing. Arthur arrived a few minutes later, walking out of the twilight. Without his duster, he looked different, less like a myth and more like a man. He wore a simple homespun shirt, the sleeves rolled to his forearms. He moved with that same quiet economy, but here, away from the prying eyes of the town, the tension in his shoulders seemed to have eased. Thank you, Mai said, her voice soft in the evening air. For what you did today. No one has ever, she trailed off, unsure how to finish. He gave a slight nod, his eyes on the creek. Sterling is a bully. Bullies only understand a firm hand. He is more than a bully, Mai said, a tremor in her voice. He owns half the town. He can make things very difficult. I know, Arthur said, and the way he said it sent a chill down her spine. He knew more than he was letting on. He sat on a fallen log, and after a moment's hesitation, Mai sat at the other end. She placed the basket between them. I brought this for you, she said. As a thank you. Not for purchase. He looked at the pie, and a strange, sad smile touched his lips for the first time. It transformed his weathered face, making him look younger. Apple, he said, more to himself than to her. It was my mother's recipe, she offered. Arthur was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, suffused with a melancholy she hadn't heard before. My sister, Sarah, she used to bake apple pies. Just like that 1 inch he finally met Mai's eyes, and the guard he kept so firmly in place seemed to fall away, revealing a profound and aching sorrow. She was younger than you. The fever took her and my mother in the same winter, back in Ohio. My father, he wasn't the same after. I was 16. I left. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Suddenly, his actions made a heart-breaking kind of sense. It wasn't just about the pies. It was about a memory, a ghost of a life he had left behind. "The first day I saw you," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "standing there behind that table, looking like the whole world was about to break you, and that pie sitting there. It smelled like my mother's kitchen. It felt like, I don't know, like a sign I was in the right place." He reached into his breast pocket, and for a second, I thought he might pull out a weapon. Instead, he drew out a small, folded piece of paper, its edges soft and frayed from countless readings. He didn't open it, but he held it in his hand as if it were a precious, fragile thing. "A letter from her," he said. "The last one she wrote me. I carry it everywhere." He looked from the letter to my. "I'm sorry for the trouble I brought you with Sterling." "You didn't bring it," she said, finding a new strength in his vulnerability. "It was already here. You just stood in its way." Their quiet moment was shattered by the sound of hoofbeats. 2 men rode into the clearing, their horses kicking up dust. One was the town sheriff, a man named Cobb whose loyalty was widely known to belong to whomever paid him best. The other was Mr. Sterling, a smug, triumphant look on his face. "Vance," Sterling called out, dismounting. "I had a feeling I'd find you here, consorting with the local vagrants." Arthur stood slowly, placing himself between me and the newcomers. His entire demeanor had shifted back to that of the gunslinger, cooled and ready. "Sheriff," he said, his voice cold. "What can I do for you?" "Mr. Sterling here has filed a complaint," Sheriff Cobb said, avoiding Arthur's eyes. "Says this woman is operating a business without a town license and is squatting in a property owned by his mercantile. He wants her removed." It was a lie, a legal trap. I rented her room from the laundry owner, but Sterling likely held the note on that building, too. He was using the law as a weapon, just as he'd used his words in the market. "She'll be gone by morning," Sterling said with satisfaction. "There's no place for her kind in Redemption." I felt the world shrink. He had one. She had no license, no deed, no one to stand for her against a man who owned the law itself. Arthur didn't look at Sterling. He looked at me, and his expression was grim. He had a choice. He could escalate this, revealing his hand and jeopardizing the larger reason he was in this town. Or he could let Sterling have this small, cruel victory, and let me be cast out. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the weight of a decision that cost more than money. He took a half-step toward the sheriff. "Sheriff Cobb," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You're making a mistake." "The only mistake," Sterling interrupted, "was thinking you could interfere in my town's business." He gestured to me. "Get her things. She's out." But Arthur didn't move. He simply reached inside his coat. It wasn't his gun he drew. It was a folded document, sealed with the authority of the United States government. He handed it not to Sterling, but to the sheriff. "My name is Arthur Vance," he said, his voice ringing with an authority that dwarfed Sterling's petty power. "I'm a U.S. Marshal. And I'm here in Redemption to investigate land fraud, specifically claims made under the 1862 Homestead Act being illegally voided and seized. Your name, Mr. Sterling, appears on a great many of those complaints." Sheriff Cobb's face went pale as he read the document. Sterling's smug expression dissolved into pure, unadulterated shock, then fear. The tables had not just turned, they had been utterly demolished. This is a misunderstanding," Sterling stammered. "I don't think so," Arthur said, his eyes like chips of ice. "And trying to intimidate a potential federal witness," he nodded toward me, "is a very serious offense. So I suggest you and the sheriff ride back to town. We have a lot to discuss in the morning." The 2 men, utterly defeated, mounted their horses and retreated, leaving a cloud of dust and stunned silence in their wake. Arthur stood watching them go, the setting sun at his back. He had made his choice, and in protecting me, he had declared war on the most powerful man in town. 3 months later, the first chill of autumn was in the air, and the cottonwood leaves by the creek were turning a brilliant gold. The town of Redemption was changing. The whispers that had once followed me down the street had been replaced by polite nods and friendly greetings. Mr. Sterling was gone, his empire of fraudulent deeds and intimidation dismantled by a quiet U.S. Marshal who had meticulously gathered testimony from cheated homesteaders. Mai no longer sold her wares from a small wooden table in the dust. She stood behind the counter of Mai's Pies, a small but proper shop at the end of the main street. The space, formerly a dusty, abandoned surveyor's office, was now filled with the constant, comforting aroma of baked goods. The deed to the building, properly filed and registered, was in her name. She had paid for it with her own earnings, the silver dollars and 10-cent pieces from a town that had finally learned her name and the quality of her work. Arthur had stayed in redemption longer than he'd intended, wrapping up the legalities of Sterling's case. He was a common sight in her shop, usually stopping by at the end of the day. He never bought all her pies anymore. He didn't need to. On a cool Tuesday afternoon, he came in and the shop was empty save for her. He walked to the counter, and his smile was easier now, the sadness in his eyes having receded, replaced by a quiet contentment. "Mai," he said, his voice the same steady presence it had been from the first day. "Marshal," she replied, a teasing light in her own eyes. "Just Arthur, please." He looked at the pies displayed under the glass case she'd had brought in by freight wagon. "I believe I'll have a slice of the apple." She cut a generous slice and placed it on a plate for him. He didn't take it to go. Instead, he sat at one of the 2 small tables she had set up by the window. She poured 2 cups of coffee, then, after a moment's hesitation, untied her apron and joined him. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the afternoon sun slanting through the clean glass. He ate the pie slowly, thoughtfully. "Still the best in the territory," he said, finally. "It's just a pie," she said softly. He put his fork down and looked at her, his expression serious. "No, it's not." It was never just a pie. He looked around the small, clean shop, at the proof of her resilience and hard work. "You built this. All of it." "I had help," she said, meeting his gaze. "You had an opportunity," he corrected gently. "You did the rest yourself." He was leaving in a week, his work in Montana finished. The telegraph had brought new orders. Another town, another problem. They both knew it, though neither had spoken of it. The knowledge sat between them, a quiet, unspoken weight. He reached across the table and his hand covered hers. His touch was warm and firm, his calloused fingers a contrast to her own, which were perpetually dusted with flour. It was the first time he had touched her. "I sent a letter to the U.S. Marshal's office in Cheyenne," he said, his voice low. "I told them there's good reason to establish a permanent territorial office here. A town this size needs a steady hand." Mai's heart gave a hopeful leap. "And what did they say?" A slow smile spread across Arthur's face. "They said if I can find a reliable deputy and a baker who makes the best apple pie in the territory, I should consider staying on myself." The afternoon sun filled the small bakery, illuminating the specks of flour that danced in the air like dust motes of gold. In a world of hardship and uncertainty, they had found each other. A woman with nothing but a recipe and a gunslinger with a ghost in his heart. They had discovered that sometimes, home is not a place you find on a map, but a small, warm space you build together, one slice of pie at a time. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.